opening up doesn't make my hand the door. because it's open now. Can I get 2 sheets of paper? Oh, there you go. Yeah, do you have 2 sheets?
Yeah. So, I can run out the bigger ones.
That would be better than that.
Alright, let's get past all the economics lectures and get to the point here. When we create this as a reserve currency, what it means is that we have increased the confidence in the yuan. There are 2 major implications of this that has ramifications for this debate. The first is that we must let me say one last thing that may seem obvious, but the implication is that foreign governments are going to be holding a damn lot more yuan than they've been holding before, alright? What are the implications of this? There are 2 of them. The first is that we have to recognize that the greater trade in the yuan and more people demanding it, the value of the yuan will increase. The second major implication is that we're going to have a greater portion of the yuan outside of China, outside of the direct control of China, than has been the case up until now. Those 2 primary implications are where pretty much this entire debate is going to flow from in some or other respect. What we're going to be arguing primarily is that we seek to encourage the integration of the Chinese economy into the rest of the world. Part of that is their money market, an absolutely central part of that. So not just that we're taking Chinese goods and that those are around the world, but also that their currency is. We're arguing that that kind of integration is going to be something good, both for China in the long run, but also for the rest of the world economy that is becoming increasingly vulnerable to things that happen with China. The fact that earlier this year the Chinese stock market crashed and sent ripples throughout the economy of the entire world, and especially emerging markets, is demonstrative of this. That's the bulk of the case we're throwing at you today. But let's talk about, for a second, before we get into substantiating why this is good, let's talk a little bit more about what happens when we increase the value of the yuan, alright? So yeah, obviously the Chinese have devalued the yuan recently. Clearly in the short run they see some sort of gain. Yes, it means more export of current Chinese-produced goods. We concede that at the moment, right? So yeah, we know that's where up wants to go. But our response back to this is firstly, they would want that more, and we're going to see less now, alright? Sorry, I see your confusion. The first thing there is to say that the export market or production for China is and needs to continue maturing. They can't continue just to make socks, alright? They need to continue now to produce more mature goods, and their economy is built to be able to handle that. We think that even though in Germany they're using the euro, which is a very powerful currency, it's still quite capable of being an export-dominant market through cars, for example. So yeah, we can see that it's a short-run difficulty for China, but I think in the long run it supports what they need. But secondly, and more importantly than that, China needs emerging markets to continue to create the demand for their own goods. And one of the implications of the Chinese instability, which is what our policy is directly aiming to solve, is that emerging economies, the BRICS, for example, are suffering quite seriously from what's happening with Chinese instability. Specifically, though, obviously, because we know it, you want to go with this and say, oh, more exports means good for them, all right? We're arguing that it's not just the mere fact of more exports. It is the fact of Chinese instability that is causing the emerging economies to suffer. It is the instability that makes investors run back to the dollar because they don't know what's happening with Chinese developing economies at the moment. That's causing the short-run shocks that these developing economies can't handle. But let me get into this in sort of more robust detail here. So what we think is going to happen then is that when there are more, obviously a greater portion of yuan is outside of Chinese control, their capacity to micromanage their economy is severely diminished. The trouble is the Chinese are pretty, well, can I say this on TV? But anyways, the Chinese are pretty shit at micromanaging their economy, alright? The bottom line is, their attempts to try and reassure investors have backfired massively because nobody understands how the Chinese work at this stage. When they started devaluing their currency, people took that as an indication that the Chinese have been lying about the state of their economy up until now, and that it wasn't just an attempt to try and boost their economy, but it was an indication that actually the damage was more severe than the Chinese had been letting on. The bottom line is that giving greater autonomy to the Chinese money market, it decreases the confidence that other people investing in China, reliant on China, have in China. We would say that the sudden fluctuations in the market are considerably more damaging than the long-run prospect of understanding the need for China to develop its export market. Shoot.
So what you have up to now is not inherent to the notion, because you don't hear an analysis of why it should be a reserve currency, but why just we should support investing more in China. Can you please actually address to why it should be a reserve currency?
Well, we just said that right at the start, right? I thought that would be pretty much the given on which this motion works, but okay, fine. The reason it's a reserve currency then is because as a reserve currency, governments are holding that in reserves because they have the confidence in it, because the IMF's backing that stuff. Currency matters because people believe currency matters, right? It's not because God's holding the currency up, right? It's the fact that the entire world believes in the strength of that currency. The IMF supporting it as a reserve currency is, in fact, the best step that we can take towards that. So, and it's likely to lead on to more governments holding that. This analysis is supported by the idea that more governments hold it as a reserve currency, all right? Having taken that step, that they're more likely to hold it in reserve. If that's where your contestation is going, good luck to you. Alright, so let's get into the last part of this thing. Why is it that we think that direct control and the secrecy surrounding Chinese money markets interactions, the unpredictability and micromanagement is dangerous? We've explained to you that is what we think happened in 2015, alright? We see that as symptomatic of the failure to have it. And we think that the policy that the IMF is pursuing now is intending to remedy what they've seen as that vulnerability in the Chinese market. So descriptively, we think that's what it's there to deal with. Also, going a little bit closer to home on what we think goes wrong, or what we could do better, what we think is a better example of how things work, with political accountability because of economic integration, we looked to our own country, alright? We looked to the fact that Nklan Nene being fired as the Minister of South Africa was something that had to be undone, alright? We can all speculate about why the guy was fired in the beginning, but we probably had internal sort of political considerations going on there that were overridden by the fact that integration with the international money market meant that he couldn't just act with impunity. We completely concede that there's a loss of sovereignty under the scenario that's being put forward by the IMF, all right? We're decreasing Chinese sovereignty. We think that's a good thing, all right? We think in the scenario where they start trying to pursue self-interested agendas at the expense of their people in many instances, we think the fact that there's a moderating influence from the currency that is held by foreigners means that you can't just act with impunity. We think the South African example where the government was then forced to do a U-turn on that decision decision, which was probably linked to like SAA and nuclear deals and all sorts of dodgy things, all right? We think the fact that the currency being held overseas made them vulnerable to invested loss of confidence in the government, meant that they had to restore that confidence as quickly as possible. We see that as an example of what is more likely to happen now with China, rather than what has been happening with China beforehand under the policy opposition needs to defend. We support the IMF's decision.
Here, I thank that speaker for that speech, and now call upon the leader of opposition to deliver the next speech. Here.
So we've actually heard a lot of reasons why we don't need to have this as a reserve currency in the PM's speech. So before I start with my arguments about how it's damaging to the world economy and also how it increases Chinese political leverage, let's talk about some of the things that they brought to us at the table. So the first thing we hear is that they need to mature their markets, that they need to have more mature exports, and they need to organize into not stock making, but maybe auto industries and stuff like that. So, but they also said that because it becomes there's more confidence embedded into the yuan, if you accept it as a reserve currency, it is going to appreciate. So we don't see how these two things can happen simultaneously at this time. If you have their exports and if you have their currency appreciating more, what is going to be more difficult is for them to export a lot of those high-priced goods. So at the same time, we believe that this is not going to make their market mature more in the short term or in the long term, especially since we already see that that is happening right now, ladies and gentlemen. They need to prove to us why this is going to be a very significant boost in terms of that, and they need to show us why there aren't incentive systems in place right now for Chinese markets to mature anyways. We believe they want to, and we believe they have the capability to do that, regardless of whether their currency is a reserve currency or not, so we don't really believe that. Now, they also brought to us this point about the Chinese lying about their economy, the Chinese lying about their monetary policy, and about the state of their currency and the state of their economy. So we have a lot of things to say about that, because we actually think this is a very good point for us. So we see that we are accepting a currency from a country that is willing to lie about the state of their economy. And that problem is there, ladies and gentlemen, is that a lot of other states are going to buy into that currency. And if we still have a state that it is able and willing to do those things, we believe we're inviting a very volatile currency, and we're actually jeopardizing the position of those countries that hold it as a reserve. So that's one problem. So we see that either A, they will continue lying about the state of their economy because they still have incentives to do that, right? So we believe that is inherently harmful for all the countries that buy into the reserve of the yuan. But if they can't do that, ladies and gentlemen, if they can't actually regulate their monetary policy to suit their micro shocks in their economy, we see that what is going to happen is they actually lose the ability to micromanage their economy. We still believe that that's a very important point, because if we believe that you take away from a volatile country, from a volatile economy, the ability to self-regulate, to use monetary policy in this case, because it now has to float more, and it now is, the confidence is placed in that currency, we believe it's very damaging because you can't avoid a lot of the short-term shocks that can turn into the very big things. Because we see that the confidence argument that they bring to us, there is nothing inherent to it just because if you make this currency a reserve currency. We see that short-term shocks can turn into very damaging problems. We see the euro being able to depreciate massively and dramatically over short periods of times, even though it is a currency that a lot of other countries hold as a reserve, ladies and gentlemen. And we see that those harms are exacerbated by China, which is undergoing slower growth right now, which is still willing to lie about their economic situation. That is highly problematic. Let's, sure, before that I'll take you.
But once again, you've presupposed that which we seek to fix, right? You've presupposed the continued lack of confidence in China.
So, no, we don't think that, no, so we gave you two scenarios. Either they're still going to be doing what you characterize them been doing historically, which is lying about the state of their economy and the state of their currency. If there is confidence placed in that currency, and that still happens, that is very dangerous. But even if they don't do that, then they lose out on a very important tool of how to actually manage shocks in their economy. So either way, we believe the international community and China loses out in this case because they can't do the things that they've been doing because they no longer have so much sovereignty over their currencies. That is a problem. Let's talk about how it's damaging to the world and Chinese economy. So because China has been lying previously about the state of their currency and has been inflating their currency or basically like not telling about the truth about the value of their currency, what they had to do is they had to open it up more to float when it was accepted and when this confidence was placed into that currency. So what this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that the yuan actually had to depreciate, which means that the people in China have lower purchasing power, and the businesses in China as well have lower purchasing power. And that is very dramatically horrible because the Chinese economy is such a huge thing in the world, and because their domestic consumption or their imports are so important to every world economy in the status quo, we believe it is highly dangerous that you have to depreciate this currency in the first place. We see that because Chinese markets are so disproportionately important in this case, and coupled with the fact that the Chinese are undergoing slower growth and are undergoing a financial crisis right now, we see that there are worldwide repercussions to that. Because it's a hugely important country to Africa, it is a hugely important country to its Asian neighbors, and because of this, because they don't have the capability to consume as much as they previously have, because they have to depreciate their currency to be accepted by the IMF, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that it hurts the international economy a lot. We believe they can't import as much, and we believe that because imports with the rest of the world are so tied to the Chinese economy, we believe it's bad for the world, and we believe that the Chinese currency is not yet ready to have that kind of confidence that we want. So let's talk about the second argument, which is a little bit less economic. But we do believe that this is actually going to grant the Chinese more leverage and more political dominance, and we do believe that that's a bad thing. Because the currency is now a reserve currency, other countries in the world means that they purchase a bulk of that currency, and they have more of a stake in the Chinese economy than they otherwise would have. We do believe that they have a huge stake in the Chinese economy, but now it is disproportionately so, because they hold a lot of this currency in the status quo right now. So we believe that because they hold a lot of this currency in the status quo, they can be more easily held hostage by the Chinese economy and by the Chinese currency, which means that it's going to be much more difficult to have some sort of economic or whatever diplomatic dialogue when China wants to venture into Southeast Asia or venture into South Asia. There are no longer the mechanisms that we have that we could otherwise exert against China economically, because now the Western states or any states in the world have a much higher interest in preserving the confidence and preserving the stability of the yuan. So the problem is in this case is that we give the Chinese political elites the power to do anything they want in the region, because it is too valuable for us, even more valuable for us, to keep the Chinese going, and we would be more willing to turn a blind eye on what they're doing right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, for all these reasons, because we don't believe it's good for the world economy, we don't believe that China, as they have characterized it to us, is going to stop doing all those things that they have been doing, or even if they will, we believe it's problematic. We beg you to oppose this motion.
Here, I thank that speaker for that speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver the next speech. Here.
Tells us is that, one, we should never harm China because it's too important to global interests that we don't allow for damage to their economy, especially because of the kind of damage that would do because of the global implications of that. But then two, they tell us, well, this kind of policy means that the policy that we propose is one that will harm the ability for us to use our economic policy to leverage against China, which is to suggest both that at the moment we're doing something that they say is bad, but secondly then to say that, well, the solution should be one where we are willing to harm China economically, where their first argument is explicitly to say that we should never do that because of the global harm. Those two arguments can't work in the same sphere at the same time, because we don't think that that's the kind, that in that way we have a consistent policy in terms of how we engage with China. What am I going to be talking about in this debate? Firstly, what I want to do is I'm going to talk more about specifically the implication of having a China where we're able to know exactly what's going on within their economy and the concerns we have about them lying. No, thank you. Then I'm going to talk about the value that we see when we change the way in which when you change the way in which China's currency operates in the global economy, where we have a recognition from the opening opposition that this is a question of a global economy. So let's get into that. The first thing here is that the way in which they respond to our analysis about the concern that we have that at the moment we aren't exactly certain what's going on in China's economy is to say, well, that's a signal that at the moment Chinese people aren't or the Chinese currency wouldn't be trustworthy because we can't trust the behavior of their institutions. Well, I think that the response here is quite obvious. Like, when you have the currency that is more globally controlled, it's not the case that China is able to deceive us to the same extent because the dynamics of the currency become global. They're not as controlled in the domestic community. And this is something that they admit to when they point out that actually you need the Chinese currency to be one that is flexible and being able to be readily used domestically. That implies that a global control of the currency is one of the ways that we are able to establish knowledge about the way in which their economy is actually behaving. It's much less volatile when it's being held by the rest of the world. I think the best example of this is when you see the US dollar appreciating after the crash because people thought it was a stable thing to buy into when economies are falling apart. We think that what this does is it creates the stability and credibility for a currency that means that it becomes an international thing rather than something that China is able to control themselves. Then let's talk about Then let's talk about the idea, specifically here, that the Chinese economy isn't in a good place, and as a result, that it's not a good kind of economy, a kind of currency to be holding. I think here what's important to recognize is not that this is a volatile economy, but we've seen the maturation of the economy, where the growth has slowed down. Like, that's not the end of the world, guys. All it means is that they're reaching growth rates that are still high, but less high than the 10% that China was at in the past. 6% growth is still pretty damn good. And we think that specifically here, what we're seeing at the moment is a rally in the Chinese economy, specifically because we see domestic household consumption being very resilient in China, and when we see the property market recovery in China being something that means that the economy is rallying. Where that's the case, what we need to do is make sure that we deter a Chinese economy that becomes more insular, because their confidence was shaken in the last year. We need to make sure that the insularity doesn't continue, because the opening opposition agrees that we have a global dependency and a global interlinking relationship in terms of how we trade and engage with China, where 5% of Western firms' profits are from engagement and trade with China. We need to make sure that they don't become more insular. We need to have some kind of mechanism that continues to pull China into the international system rather than allowing them to have an encouragement of the kind of government intervention that happened this year that we think was quite harmful. We think it's better if we're able to move away from that kind of mechanism. And the best way to do that is to make it more globalized, make it more accountable, and make it something that they care about how the global economy reacts and the global economy engages with their currency. We think that the IMF is the best way to do that. Closing.
Who do you think is actually going to buy yuan as a reserve currency after the IMF is going to recognize it as a reserve currency?
So I think it's largely going to be linked to the fact, the kind of people who are going to buy are the people who are trading with China at the moment, right? So I think that it's in instances where you already have vested interest in their economy and you want to increase the stability in that way. But I also think that in general, when you want to diversify portfolios of what you hold, it makes sense that you would diversify into a new economy or diversify into a new currency, because that's how risk pooling works. So we think that in general, it'll be a lot of different kinds of places that are going to be willing to do this. Then I think specifically then what we need to talk about is the concern in terms of exports that we get. Where what we tell you here that's really important is that we think that the Chinese economy has reached a point where we want to allow for the improvement, an improvement in the kind of area of the market that they occupy, specifically because of the kind of links that we see between China and African markets, where what we would prefer is that emerging markets are able to take the kind of bottom rungs of the ladder that we see China being able to occupy at the moment. And we think that that gets much better when you have an appreciation of their currency specifically. The reason being is that once you have an appreciation of their currency, the kind of exports that they move into are the things like you see in Germany and Japan, which are more complex kind of manufactured goods, the kind of goods that you're still able to export when you have a strong currency, but aren't the kind of basic goods or cheap manufactured goods that we see being manufactured or that we see being very desirable markets to move into as emerging market kind of country. And specifically where we think that's good is that places like Africa, who have been so dependent on China and engagement with China, are then able to occupy that part of the market in response to the weakening kind of investment that we see coming from China. The next thing that we think is that when you make the Chinese currency a more international kind of currency, they become pushed towards being a more investment-driven economy, the kind of economy that is willing to put their money in other places in order for it to grow, because when your currency is stronger, you start to favor investments over specifically favoring all the time production. We think that kind of investment incentive is good because we think it creates a better kind of relationship in terms of how they're going to be engaging with other places in Asia, but also in Africa in terms of the dependency that we have on the massive economy that is China. So in terms of that as well, we think that the strong currency is good in terms of the IMF agenda, in terms of improving economic circumstances in a variety of different countries, in a variety of different places. Specifically, what we think is good then is not that. So that finally, then I think what's important to recognize is that while you don't lose flexibility completely just because the currency becomes more stable, right? Once you have a more stable currency, like the point of money is that it becomes more credible. We think that credibility is incredibly important in order to restore the confidence that we need China to have in the international community and international markets so that we avoid a situation where they become more insular and we lose the ability to trade with them. We lose the benefits that places like Africa and Asia are deriving from having that kind of superpower engaged with them at the moment. We need this kind of policy in order to push the maturation of China. We think this is the best way to do it.
Here, I think that speaker for that speech now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the top portion of the debate.
Mr. Chair, what we hear from opening government is a wonderful case for why we should have better trade integration with the Chinese markets. No reasons coming from them why we need the yuan as a reserve currency at all, or why it actually benefits along any of the axis that they try to convince us that the Chinese economy will grow. What they tell us rather is that the Chinese economy needs to mature so that Africa can take the bottom rungs of development. Not only do we think that's problematic normatively, but pragmatically, that's not possible because we think that what some of the problems with China getting to that place are structural. And the reasons why we cannot currently get there quicker are slowed down even further by having the yuan as a reserve currency and as a precondition of that reserve currency being adopted, having them depreciate it. And so we think that that will be something that we'll talk about more in our substantive, but something that really, really damages the constructive that's coming out from OG. Three things kind of generally first before we get into rebuttal. First of all, we think it's important to recognize the proclivity of the Communist Party to use economic leverage and further their national interests. When they joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, there were a whole range and plethora of things that they were meant to do and continue to comply with along the years. In the 15 years since, they've successfully and consistently broken everything and stealthily moved around antitrust requirements, tariff and quota requirements. And so it's clear that on an international stage, when you think that they're going to be kept accountable by the most robust international trade organizations, that they are still able and willing to move around those things in their own personal interest. And so we think that the stakes are even much higher, no thank you, with reserve currencies because of the injection of that currency into other capital markets. And we think that that's a problem. Secondly, we want to ask ourselves, at what point should we issue currency as a reserve? We think there are several criteria that countries should generally meet. First of all, we think it's important that economies are generally not at points of transition because especially when they're experiencing downward growth. Why is this important? Because it signals nothing consistent about the direction of that economy. We don't think it's enough to say, to conjecture on opening government that the Chinese economy is going to end up growing eventually. No, it's a huge problem to actually make this choice at a time where we are really unsure. The top economists from the Fed, the IMF, the World Bank have no idea in terms of where the economy is necessarily going to go. We have ideas about it, but we don't think that this is a good time to actually put the yuan as reserve currency. More than that, we need to have countries that have identified long-term strength and stability in terms of consistent growth at a steady rate. China does not meet that requirement. More than that, we need a political commitment to transparency. Again, we don't have that from China. To clarify, thirdly, on this point about okay, harm to China versus like the leverage point that we're making. What we're saying and argued is that this policy is really bad for domestic consumers in China as well as our trading partners. That is a harm that we've identified. On the flip side, we think it's bad for the international community in terms of their ability to leverage this point of pressure in like diplomatic relations. That is the point that we're actually making. A few more points of rebuttal before we move into constructive. When they tell us that we need to mature economies so that Africa can take over, we tell you that there are structural problems that don't allow them to actually do that are actually halted by this reserve policy. But more than that, we told you that the underlying logic of their analysis is untrue. They told us simultaneously that the yuan is going to appreciate, with no apparent reason why that's going to be the case, when it's already being depreciated by the government, as well as have like highly like exportable goods that are, like really high in quality. Both of those things cannot happen at the same time. If your currency appreciates massively, you are going to have a slowdown in export growth because your goods become less exportable. And we heard no response to that. We hope we'll get one from closing. What we hear from the DPM is that like certainty for China is going to be all right because they're simply unable to be more deceptive under the status quo in terms of the IMF. Sure, even if we recognize that they're able to be less deceptive in the context of having the yuan as a reserve currency, we think that even small acts of deception, which they are more than willing to do in various trade agreements as well as like their record with the WTO, like really small like deceptions are really, really damaging because like countries need as like a basic premise to like ensure the true value of their reserves are maintained. So countries that now adopt the yuan as a reserve currency are no longer going to have that confidence in their reserves. We think that's really damaging in terms of things like buying bonds and like financing fiscal policy. More than that, when they tell us that like the growth is still okay and the Chinese economy is rallying, we think that the resiliency of the Chinese economy is actually like decreased by this policy and by decreasing the value of yuan. When they tell us about insularity, like these are all reasons why trade integration is really, really important and valuable, and we can drive a lot of the same points about growth and stability and economic development from trade integration. It's unclear to us entirely from OG why we need to have the yuan as a reserve currency. We think that trade is more relevant, is more targeted, and it's more flexible to local and regional bodies and their needs, more so than this policy of making the yuan a reserve currency is. No thank you. Third argument of constructive coming out from opening opposition, while we think that this pivots China back to short-term goals, which is damaging. Central banks are occupied with monetary policy that have two large outcomes. First, to stabilize prices, and second, to try to reach total unemployment around 4%, right? So the tactic to control inflation has largely been propping up the yuan in the past, in addition to using things like inflation rates. But because propping up the yuan has been such an integral tool by which the government has been able to control these monetary goal policies, we think that that is the way that they've largely stimulated growth in the past. What this means is that foreign imports and domestic consumption drop under their policy. We think that the most likely outcome then is, as the yuan continues to be a reserve currency, is in order to sustain domestic growth, they will reinvest and pivot back to short-term development strategies. What does that look like? It looks more like coal-powered industries when green technology is essential for long-term growth, as well as a shift in the structure back towards things that yield short-term dividends as opposed to investments and structural readjustments that allow the Chinese economy to adapt to what they need to be in 50 years from now. That isn't possible when domestic consumption is already dampened by the policy that OG is pushing on us. I'll take closing.
Yeah. Why do you think it is that China set out in their 5-year plan to have their currency inside the IMF if this is such a bad thing for their economy?
We think that we've already outlined all the reasons why this benefits China from a central party perspective in terms of actually gaining a lot of leverage. And it's a big deal to have the yuan as a global reserve currency. And so we think that there's symbolic and material reasons why the Chinese government has already done this. But beyond that, what we think then is that importantly, monetary policy alone cannot stimulate the growth that is required to re-stimulate the Chinese economy. You need fiscal policy to make investments in the real economy. But fiscal policy is also deeply damaged by a weakened yuan because you do not have the leverage or the capacity to actually do the things in the economy to stimulate that kind of growth. This is bad for the environment, it's bad for the middle class, and it's bad for development. In a world where they are still likely to thwart the rules and get around the decent transparency that they claim is going to happen, this is even particularly worse and accelerated on their side of the house. So despite the reasons why the Chinese government would want to do this, we think that it's because they're going to have to pivot back to short-term needs and short-term goals in terms of strengthening the actual domestic growth, and we think that is bad for long-term middle class growth and development. For all these reasons, we are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Here, I think that speaker for that speech and call upon the member of government for the next speech we're at. Here.
Two points of extension from closing government. One, opening government tell you they want a maturation of the Chinese market. We want to tell you what that looks like, and in contention with the second point on closing of the last speaker, why it's likely to take place. Secondly, we want to talk about political power, because we think this is actually exceptionally advantageous to us politically to be able to create economic talks with China, which revolve not in the UN Security Council in a setting in which China can veto issues, but in a setting in which they are 1 out of 4 vote and can be overvoted, outvoted, or even convinced into accepting our stance on issues. Before that, 2 points of rebuttal. One, on devaluing the economy. Look, there's clearly a misconception in opening opposition as to what's been happening in China. The value of their currency has not devalued over time, but rather was actively kept low by the Chinese government at the point at which the Chinese government was attempting to perpetuate an economy of export. However, note that they recognize themselves that they cannot continue to do this at the point at which they joined the IMF. They accept the fact that their economy then needs to move on from being an economy dependent entirely on export, and crucially, they accept the fact that the monetary value of their currency is going to rise. Note that in itself wipes out like 3/4 of opening opposition, because all of their chat about like the value of the standard of living within China is flipped on them at the point at which the only incentive for China to stop controlling their economy, the monetary value, and to stop keeping it low is specifically because they want to join the IMF. So all of that, now arguments on our side of the house. Secondly, we would note something particularly interesting in that in response to a point on micromanagement, the first speaker said, listen, if micromanaging were something good for China, it's probably something that China would do. Note this accepts the logic that China, A, knows what's best for its own economy, and B, is likely to act in order to perpetuate what's best for their economy. Under that notion, we're entirely unclear how anyone on opposition can run a line saying this is harmful for China's economy, because China itself, within its 5-year plan, sets out to become a part of the IMF and strives to become a part of the IMF, noting that this is probably better for their economy under their own logic. First point of argumentation on how markets shift. No. The point is like this. Initially, China's comparative advantage over other countries in the world were the fact that it managed to have like just tons of people who can work for really cheap. However, that's why for so many years they've been working on an economy of exports and creating things for cheap, right? Building things essentially. However, what they've managed to build with a GDP of roughly 10% over the past couple of years is an enormous seed capital that allows them to invest into their own market. Notice seed capital that they would not have been able to get had they not been working on a market of exports for many years based on that. The thing is, though, at this point, once they have this seed capital in order to invest in their own economy, they now have 2 things. A, the ability to create a more self-sustaining and developing economy in the sense of creating a more creative economy as opposed to building. What does this look like when it comes to China? Largely, we think this looks like information technology, right? This is something that the Chinese government has been substantially looking into, has been working towards, and note this is something that a lot of people in China have the ability to advance. Now, they tell you on opening opposition, well, look, the problem with this is structural problems. You know what a really great way to change structural problem is? Have a government entirely incentivized to work against these structural problems, enormously incentivized to create solutions to stop these structural problems. No, thank you. At the point at which you have a Chinese government that is dependent on an economy with a valued money that needs to create things that can be sold on an international market in spite of the high price, you know what they get? A really great incentive to start investing in things like infrastructure of education, no thank you, like the ability to create a subculture of startup companies within their market, like angel investors around there. Now, lastly, Why is all of this so crucial? Because one, it's like really good for the Chinese market, which we say is probably a good thing within China, and certainly according to the contentions of opening.
Sure.
But note, it is also exceptionally good for us at the point at which this creates a shift in political power in China. How does this create the shift? We would point to you to Jack Yen, the person who started Alibaba. He's the only people who's able to speak out against the Chinese government in spite of the fact that that most people are just not allowed to do that in China. He's able to do that because the revenue he creates for China is so massive that they don't have the ability to shut him up. We say at the point at which the Chinese economy develops in a way that more citizens are more involved in businesses that make more money for China, there are more oppositional voices that can be heard within China, and we would note that that is probably a decent interest of ours as the rest. First.
Okay, why do you think, according to your logic, the government has so far as early as August depreciated the currency again?
Like short-term issues of having to do that like really briefly. We think in general they've already conceded to the fact that if they join the IMF, they have to stop depreciating their own currency artificially. We think they've already agreed to do that, and we think the backlash they would get if they did that nonetheless would be so enormous that they wouldn't possibly think of doing it. Secondly, on political power. Note currently, they say we won't be able to have any influence over China because we can no longer sanction them. However, that's non-comparative because for years now our investment and business relations with China were of such mutual dependency that we never sanctioned them, or certainly never sanctioned them substantially in any way, right? It was very difficult for us to do that anyway. What changes? Our ability to negotiate with them. Why does that change? Up until now, negotiations would take place in the UN Security Council, at which point China has a veto. This means two things. One, they can veto it in general, but two, they're less susceptible to the negotiations themselves, because psychologically in the back of their mind, they're aware of the fact that they don't actually have to participate in these negotiations because of the veto power. At the point at which these negotiations can happen in a separate sphere, and they are forced to participate because their currency is a part of the IMF, we have the more ability to convince them, more ability to get them to vote on our side, not on putting sanctions on them, but perhaps on things like sanctioning Iran, which are also important to our causes. We beg you to propose.
For that speech, and now call upon the member of opposition to look for the next speech in the round. You're here.
Dear panel, 2 points in extension. Firstly, a deeper analysis on why the Chinese economy in the status quo is inherently unstable and is a very bad way in order to do reserve. I know it sounds a bit like the point by opening opposition, but we are going to add new and very important analysis there. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about, in the international sphere, Chinese backlash, why China is not likely to actually approve of such a policy that allows too much control for the international market over its domestic affairs, and we're actually likely to see more Chinese closing up in direct engagement with what we just heard from closing government. Before that, a few points of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, note that both governments have this assumption that the value of money mainly depends on people's trust in that money. That is true to an extent. However, money obviously also is tied to some value behind that money. Therefore, if we show you the Chinese economy is likely to deteriorate over the coming years, and this money is also likely to deteriorate, therefore any country that buys it as reserve is likely to be significantly harmed. Secondly, CG makes a big deal out of Chinese investment in information technology and so on. No, this is not actually inherent to the motion. If China is investing in these technologies because they are good for its economy, it is likely to do that on both sides of the house, with or without the IMF acknowledging the yuan. However, note that most of Chinese economy is still mostly reliant on big industry, on the cheap labor force, and so on. If we at some point in the future get to a situation when what they're describing is the real affair of Chinese economy, then we may discuss putting it as a reserve money, as a reserve currency, but not right right now. Then they tell us, but then they tell us we have more of an ability to negotiate with China because we have a new forum. They seem to think that currently we are only having discussions with China through the UN Security Council. China is part of the WTO, where it has very important stakes. China is part of the International Atomic Energy Agency, where it doesn't have a veto. China is part of a lot of bilateral agreements and trade agreements with the US, with the EU, where they are an equal partner, and they have the discussion there. We simply don't think this is so necessary. Let's talk about instability, because opening opposition tells us two things. They tell us that the Chinese economy is unstable because they lie about the currency, and therefore we cannot trust it, and we generally don't know where this trajectory of that economy is. On that, the governments tell them we get more trust. They get actually more trust on their side of the house, so the trust problem that drives down the Chinese economy is actually solved. What we come up and tell you is there are a few structural problems in the Chinese economy that make it inherently unstable and in a downwards trajectory. Firstly, is the notion that in long term, the one-child policy in China created a situation of an aging population in which in the next few years, China will have significantly less labor force, which was the main pillar of its economy, and a lot more people that it needs to provide for, elderly and so on. This is, we say, something that's bound to make Chinese economy go down significantly. Moreover, we're saying that the higher standards of living of people necessitate more higher salaries for people for workers within China, again undermining their current economic model. Thirdly, we say that they have more competition from other rising economies within the developing world who actually employ the Chinese model, but better because they are in a lower economic situation, therefore can have even lower wages and more driving economy in the ASEAN nations and so on. Now, opening government tell us that slowing down in their economy is not such a bad thing. This may be true for Europe. However, in China specifically, their model is built around the notion that the government pays off the public in order to stem democratic reforms, in order to keep the ruling party in power. Why is this so critical? Because the incentive when there is a slowdown in the Chinese economy is to put huge sums of money into that economy in order to make it work. That's how you create investment bubbles when you try and get more people to spend more of their money directly. Then people who are not educated in how to actually invest this money, people actually are more likely to invest unwisely, and when you have things like commodity crashes, you get these bubbles exploding, and you actually have a huge slowdown in the Chinese economy, just like what happened now. Why is this so critical? Because we say that as a reserve currency, this is simply terrible in terms of destroying other economies when Chinese market does crash, which is bound to do because of these models we just explained. What specifically is terrible for the regional economies, which OG tell us are the main ones who are going to be influenced, or the main ones who are going to buy because they want the reserve. To be on because they have a specific vested interest in trading with China. Now, when these ASEAN nations actually buy more of these reserves in a time of crisis, which also affects them because it's similar kinds of industries, they are more likely to not to have the reserve that they need in order to step up their own economy, in order to be able to sustain it. We're saying this is critical in creating a regional crash in those areas. Before I go on to my talking about Chinese backlash, I'm going to take opening. Go.
All right, so it's quite interesting because your opening up just told us that it's a given that China is going to be central to the continued world economy, and that there is a trajectory that we all have to go along with.
Thank you. Obviously, they're still a major part of the world economy. However, this doesn't. The specific trajectory of if their growth is 6% or 2% or even negative, they are still a great economic power. However, it is hugely harmful towards the economy that are investing in them. Let's talk about Chinese backlash, because we say that China doesn't the reason China, for example, has its stock market closed to the West and not allowing foreign nations to invest in it is because China views this not only in economic terms, but also as a political tool. We're saying specifically losing independence over your own budgetary policy is hugely harmful to China and how it views the things itself. While OG want to tell us, and CG also, that this will actually be better for Chinese economy, this is definitely not how the Chinese government see it. Why is this critical? Because we're saying, first of all, this leads to China stepping away from international financial institutions. They are more likely likely to want to, when they see the US, for example, as a competitor, can now come into their markets and take over large shares of the yuan, and take away from them the control they have over their markets. They're more likely to step away from financial institutions critical to what CG is trying to tell us. Moreover, they have more of a tendency to play with the currency even more to decrease trust in order to stop the US from buying that currency. We're saying that's hugely problematic. And we're saying, moreover, note that when they're talking to us about export, when China has a harder time exporting, this also means that you're harming the US economy, the economies in the West, because you're heightening prices there as well through appreciating the yuan. We're saying this is critical, and this is something they have to address on their side of the house. For all these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Apparently, a lot of people in this room know a lot better how to run the Chinese economy than the experts whose job it is inside China to run the Chinese economy. Yeah? Done, maybe you, Ayal, not so much. So what we say here is quite simple. We say, look, China is a country which has put forward planning of its economy very much onto its standard bearer. They have 5-year plans where they enter all the communist parties, all the actors they want to talk about, go in and create the kind of policies that they think are going to be best for China in the long run, right? This is something which is crucial for us to understand. So much of this analysis is essentially telling us why China doesn't know how to run its own economy. We think this isn't necessarily true. We think China has proved over the years to run its economy incredibly well, and we think they have identified an opportunity that they can now appreciate. So what I'm going to be talking to you here is why the Chinese market, what's going to happen inside the Chinese market, what happens regarding international stability in the currency market, and what happens in international cooperation. So regarding the Chinese market, what we maintain and what we say, in the first house what we hear is that the Chinese market can go one of two places. Opening opposition mischaracterize what exactly happens inside the market when you open it up, and they say, oh, it's going to be a depreciation of the currency, ignoring the fact that that is currently what happens today when we simply set the currency to being exports, ignoring the fact that the Chinese have set themselves a goal to no longer involve themselves and no longer involve themselves and set the currency at its current rate, but allow it to float as a precondition of being allowed inside the IMF. Please also note that at the point in time when China suddenly decides to start messing around with that, this is now not a small transgression that they've done. They have broken a huge international pact, an international agreement, one of the most formal things. China's incentive is not to go head-to-head with the West. There may be certain amounts of soft power that they're playing, but the moment they're inside this integral system, they can no longer suddenly do these little transgressions that they want to talk about. Now, what we hear from opening government is that what we're seeing from China is a move from making small things into making cars. We think this is not quite the right characterization. While we think some of the time people might move to the interest of making more automobiles and stuff like that, we think what China has identified is the ability of itself to now become into a burgeoning technological market. Now, please notice, this is also something which has, payoffs, right? This is something which they don't necessarily have to do. They think, under the equation, where I also get to go inside the IMF, no thank you, I also gain that kind of soft capital, meaning, however, I lose control over my currency, but I can also gain economic advantages through the means of creating and making a technological sphere. Under this equation, it is worth for me to pivot and move my economic policy. This is an answer to Eyal, who says, well, this just isn't relevant, because if China wanted to do this, then they would just do this anyway. Please note, Mr. Speaker, this means this isn't true, because China is seeing the move into the IMF and the soft capital gains that they get through that as part of the equation that they're setting up. This is why this is integral to this. This is especially integral when one of the conditions of entering the IMF was for it to stop messing with its currency. No, thank you. Now, we hear a lot of reasons from Eyal about why it is that the Chinese are so bad at running their economy and why it is that it's going to be bad in the future. Now, please note this ignores everything, all the analysis Eitan provided about where the Chinese currency is going, where the kind of benefits that we can get under this plan, and the political benefits that we get as well, none of which is engaged with, and we won't have any opportunity to respond to. Now, the other thing is, what he does tell us is his own competing analysis. He says, well, the Chinese population is really old, and they're going to have higher salaries, and they're going to be, there's going to be greater competition from other countries. We say exactly. These are the exact kind of people who we think should be able to pivot towards doing things such as inside European economies, which have a similar kind of set of characteristics and have a very successful technological and information technology business. These are the kind of systems that we would appreciate, that we would appreciate the Chinese economy also wanting to do. Now, if they're going to tell us that this is a huge problem with China, they also need to explain to us why this isn't problematic with the other countries who are also like this around the world. And what we say, and again, the issue of China willing to pay off its citizens under specific details, under specific goals, and again, moving in and depreciating its economy, please note, again, this means that we have to break the rules of the IMF in order to do so. This again puts them head-to-head with what is going with a major agreement, in the international community. Now let's talk about international stability. Because first of all, Eyal's wrong in his characterization when he talks about what happens with burgeoning economies. Please note, the IMF isn't saying everybody now have the Chinese wrong. What they're saying is, let's have 6% of this inside the other currencies that you have. This means that all of the analysis that they provide about how, the other countries around them are just going to invest 100% in yuan is just simply not the case. They are going to have part of their economy be also based on the Chinese. This knocks out that entire bit of that case. No thanks. But what we say more than that is diversification of your portfolio is something which is incredibly important. We think that the crash of the dollar and the kind of damages that did on burgeoning economies is hugely problematic. We think at the point in time when you're diversifying these kind of the risks that you have in the international community, we think that it's better for us to also enter the Chinese equation. I'll take closing.
So OG's first line in this debate basically is saying China doesn't know how to run its economy and therefore needs the IMF. Your analysis is basically opposite to the wrong because China knows how to run its economy. Which of you is wrong and why?
No, I don't think they said that at any point, right guys? No, yeah. So yeah. We're both right, you're wrong. Now about the issue of the international cooperation. What opening opposition tells us is that we'll be so invested inside what's going on inside China now that we simply won't make any changes. Eitan already answers this when he says, look, we're already invested in China. The question is, where do we have these kind of conversations take place? Now, Eyal says, no, but we already have these conversations taking place in other arenas. What we say is that the point in time when you need to make massive changes and impose massive amounts of sanctions on an international scale, these kind of trade agreements that they're talking about aren't those places where you go and do this. Individual trade agreements between countries, between blocks, aren't the way that you can do this. When you use international consensus, for instance, to put a sanction on Iran. The only place that you can do that today is under the Security Council. Tomorrow, you can also do this here. Why? Because the financial control of the entire world is where this is taking place. These are where these limitations can put this. When you put this again in a kind of place, in a kind of platform, when China no longer has the veto power, we believe that the kind of changes and influences you can make on them are superior. So we think that the Chinese will have an amazing market. We think that it creates international stability and international cooperation. We are very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for that speech, and I call upon the opposition whip to deliver the actual final speech in the round.
Okay? 3 points of clash. Firstly, why we can have alternatives to everything that the governments want to have in this debate without the backlash to the development of the Chinese economy. Secondly, why in world economies in terms is actually a shit reserve currency. And thirdly, the influence in the IR and the middle spheres there. Let's start with the first question in this debate. What the governments in both of the cases want to achieve, right? They want an capping, no more stocks economy. They want an integration into the world sphere throughout these policies because they claim that specifically reserves is going to gain more trust, more control, more knowledge of the market. Then CG adds that they want to talk about Iran to have more leverage, right? More negotiation, etc., etc., etc. A couple of points on that. Firstly, China is already a part of the IMF. If they're not, and I'm mistaken, you can actually include them in the IMF. Moreover, we can actually support the opposition, give them more power in the IMF itself if you want to actually integrate them there. We can actually also support more trade agreements with China. Even joining them to the TPP, which is currently taking place, is actually less of a radical stance than actually having the yuan as a reserve policy. You can also do things as encourage FDIs in China to introduce the tech technologies that CG wants in this debate. Right? If the United States would have thought that this is a good idea, they can direct all of their foreign direct investments specifically into these companies without making the yuan the reserve currency. I'm going to tell what are the direct effects on that in a second. They can even incentivize that. When OG tells you about, but what about Africa and the investments there? Here is a radical thought. If you want to protect the investment in Africa via the West, let's just invest directly in Africa itself. This is not inherent to the motion in any way. What is the backlash that we bring specifically in our extension? Note, Benji in CG tells you the following thing. China really wants it. How come? Because they put it in their 5-year plan and debaters cannot match economists in the real world. Note a crucial distinction and a point of rebuttal to this point. The fact that the Chinese party wants it doesn't mean that it is better for the Chinese people like we have seen a lot of time in the past. What do we mean by that? Recognize the following thing as we tell you throughout every part of the opposition bench. They need control of their market in order for the party to be a sustainable bid. Even if they want it themselves, it means that they have to actually strengthen the protections of their inner market. How do we know that they're going to do this? They're going to be less likely to open their stock markets for foreign investments, a process that have already started with Hong Kong. The fact that people can now place money into Beijing and Shanghai, this is something which is going to be less likely if more people are going to have a share of the yuan. They're going to have more close of media reports about their economic states and less of an incentive to report to the world because they know that they now, in order for them to devalue the currency, if they're going to need it in the current future, they're going to know that they need more control of their inner markets. Why is it bad for the world economy and for the Chinese? Because recognize the following thing, and this is specifically what when we talk about backlash in our extension, we mean specifically that. Recognize the following. In order for the world to actually have influence, in order for them to actually be integrated into the world economy, we need to sway them and they need to be opened up. If it's going to be a trade-off of just countries being dependent upon themselves specifically by holding more and more yuans, however, they're closing the market for getting more knowledge, for getting more information, for getting proper reports, this is something which is going to take the step backwards and not forward. Let's talk about specifically the influence, the direct influence about the world economy. OGO already started and tell you it's going to divert money to the short-term needs. A couple of things that we add on that. A, it's going to hurt exports in the short term. How do we know it? Because you're going to curb demand as OG already recognized in their points. What do we mean by that? They know that they're going to have a problem exporting, which means that it means that the capacity of exports and the capacity of the amount of supply into the market is going to drop, which means that prices are going to rise in the West, which means that you are going to get a problem and you are going to screw other developing economies because you're going to skew up prices. Secondly, it is inherently, this is a crucial addition in our case, not a stable currency. How do we know it? Note, less growth that is going to come from the one-child policy, higher salaries that have to be paid, more competition that add to the market. It means that they have a middle income trap inherently right now. Recognize the following. It is correct that maybe 30 years in the future, they are going to have a diversified economy. But if we're going to have this motion 30 years in the future, we are willing to recognize adding the yuan. However, adding the yen as a reserve currency in the 40s is probably not a good idea as making the yuan right now. How do we know? Because recognize the following, and this is another thing that we add in our extension was not rebutted. Who, and already gave it to POI, who is actually going to be more likely to buy the yuan? As said, exports and the people that are more dependent on exports are more likely to buy it. Case in point, which is kind of trivial. Israel have a lot of dollars and have a lot of euros, however it doesn't have any yen, even though it is a reserve currency. Why does it matter? Because most of the time you buy a reserve currency to the country that you are actually exposed to, specifically in cases in which you have a clear incentive to actually expose yourself to these markets. Countries like the Philippines, countries like Malaysia have more of an incentive because they want to devalue their own currency in order to have more of a share to increase and boost their exports to the bigger market within the region. Why does it matter? Because you're exposing A, countries which are weaker within the region. B, I'm going to use it in a second to show you why in terms of international relation it's going to be a catastrophe, but appear beforehand first.
Sir, our contention has been about stability of the yuan market. Comparatively against your extension, we still provide greater stability.
No, you do not provide greater stability. You're just putting more money into something which is necessarily going to crash in the future, in something that you cannot regulate, in something that you are going to have more sway of, specifically, note, weaker countries. This is not a motion about saying that the US, if you want, can invest much more. We can actually even recognize the thing that if you want to stabilize the country, let them even join the TPP or something. This is not about a reserve currency, specifically if you're talking about Africa, specifically if you're talking about Malaysia, specifically if you're talking about Philippines, specifically if you're talking about countries that are going to be more exposed to them, which are the likely consumers of more yuan if you're going to put it as a reserve currency. Note, you're going to hurt specifically these economies and thus even more destabilize the currency. Even if China claims it wants it, it is not the interest. Let's talk about IR. Crucial following thing. It is okay, I already tell you that they're going to get a leverage which we do not want them to get. Why does it matter? And let's make it concrete via our extension, not just something which is ambiguous. What do we mean by that? The mere fact that the countries that are going to be the likely countries that are going to be exposed to the yuan are countries as the ASEAN nations, as we mentioned in our extension, means that China is going to have more of an influence in its domestic sphere. Why does it matter? Because this is the exact sphere in which the United States is trying and struggling and putting a lot of resources which is diverted currently from the Middle East to there in order to have more of a control on. They have many allies within the region. Why does it matter? Because it means that everything that you want to negotiate means they're going to have more of a power and more of a sway from within this area. This is a horrible thing because of all of these reasons. Because we win because there are alternatives to all that you want to achieve. Because the economics is going to be a catastrophe, and because in terms of IR it's a stupid idea, we beg you to oppose the motion.
Here, I think that's it for the speech. I think all the debaters and their speeches come around, invite them to cross and shake hands and ask everyone who's not in charge. Make everyone's team name.
Yeah.